And thank you all for coming to this webinar. My name is Dave Sherwin. I'm a professor at Cornell School of Hotel Administration. We're part of the S.E. Johnson College of Business. And I'm the director of CILR, the Cornell Center for Innovative Hospitality, Labor and Employment Relations, the world's longest name of any center. We've got a great panel today to discuss something that is part of the news that people are talking about all the time. And the question is, as we're all looking at vaccinations and the so-called vaccine reluctance that is an issue in the country, one of the issues that people are asking is, what about employers? Should employers require their employees to be vaccinated? And we're going to address that question by having folks with coming from, I think, every aspect of the issue. We have David Ritter, who is a management side lawyer and a partner at Barnes & Thornburg in their Chicago office. So that kind of gives us our legal side on the legal opinion from the management. Then we have Christine Hogan, who is a partner at Wigdor & Associates, which is a plaintiff side employment firm in New York City. So that gives us the other side. John Boardman, the president of Local 25 of Unite Here, which is in Washington, D.C., would tell us there's a third side, that would be the union. And then there's somebody who actually works for a company that provides services and employs all these people, and that's Abigail Sharpenter from Four Seasons. And Abigail, thanks for being with us. So when we look at this issue, there is the legal side, and then there is the practical and the practical aspect of working with your employees. So, but you can't start by doing something that's unlawful. So we got to start with the law. And the first question is, when we look at vaccines, there's an argument that's out there that says I shouldn't be required to take the vaccine because of religious beliefs. And the argument is that my religion needs to be accommodated under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And if I don't want to have this vaccine, then you can accommodate me because of my religion. Now, the legal geeks among us know that when it comes to religion, all you need is a sincere belief in your religion. So it doesn't have to be a religion. It doesn't have to be a top 3, top 5, top 10 religion that we all know of. You could have a sincere belief in a religion that is the anti-vaccine religion. And as long as it's a true and sincere belief, that is your religion. Now the question is, when you have a sincere and true belief in your religion, and it requires an employer to accommodate that, meaning what I want to wear, when I can work, certain foods that I can handle or not, what does the employer have to do? We have these terms that we use. We know the employer needs to accommodate the religion reasonably. We know there's a reasonable accommodation. We have a term that we use, and we use it in disability, which we'll get to later, and it is the same term, reasonable accommodation. But the meanings are very different. So I'm going to start with David to just give me an overview of what does an employer have to do. And I think the best way to describe it is the lead case that is still the law that tells us where the employer needs to go. David.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. We should be Dave 1 and Dave 2. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here and talk to you about this today. So I could probably ramble on for a long time about this, but I'm going to stay precise to what Dave's question was. And under Title VII, Dave is right, as usually is, there's a requirement to reasonably accommodate employees. Under Title VII and religious discrimination, that obligation for employers under the law is what's called de minimis. For those of you not steeped in Latin, like me, it means very little. You don't have to do much. And in this U.S. Supreme Court case, I did a little bit of looking just yesterday to see how little is little. Now, granted, this is way back many decades ago, mid-'70s back to the late '60s. It was $150. An individual wanted an accommodation to not work on Saturdays because he was a Jehovah's Witness, and the cost of the company was going to be $150. The case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. They say, well, that's not de minimis. That's too much money to make an employer accommodate someone based on religion. Okay, fast forward from mid-'70s to today. How does that apply? Pretty much the same. The number could be a little different, but you get the sense that an employer doesn't have to do much to accommodate an employee who's alleging they need a reasonable accommodation, even if they can meet the pretty lax standard that David said, that you have the anti-vax religion. They still have to come forward with some information. Rest assured, there's not many tenants in religions recognized today that are anti-vaccine. We could have that conversation over some adult beverages sometimes, but that's not much of a religious tenant. So I'm going to leave it at that, just with the religious accommodation being de minimis, unless, David, you want to follow up on that.
Well, I just want to throw in is that, so the case that David was referencing is Hardison versus TWA, and the employee worked for one of the largest airlines in the late 60s into the early 70s, and because he didn't want to work or couldn't work on Saturday because he was a Jehovah's Witness, the case said that he was supposed to, pursuant to a seniority system, cover for somebody who was on vacation and was going to have to work a couple Saturdays or 3 Saturdays in a row. And as David said, it would have cost them $150 because instead of having to pay Mr. Hardison time, they would have had to pay another employee time and a half. So the differential was the half, and the half was $150. And for those old people like us, we remember how expensive it was to fly in the 70s before deregulation came. And so even though the dollar is different, I would argue that a flight from New York to LA was probably $300, $400, $500 then, like it is now. So this guy was asking for probably a third of one flight. And the Supreme Court said, no, that is too much for one of the largest air carriers in the world. So to David's point, de minimis is really small. And so there's not much you have to do. But for the last decade or even more, the EOC has been trying to push more religious accommodation, but this case is still the law of the land. So Christine, I imagine that people come into your office and say, it's not fair, I am fill in the blank religion, and I don't want to shave, I want to wear this headwear, I want to wear this, I want to not work this, whatever the religious tenets require.
Right.
You got this case out there, but the EEOC is kind of on your side, and you've got a very religious Supreme Court that, there was a run of cases that said, if it's religion, we're going to make it work. That's what we had throughout the beginnings of the pandemic. So what is your take as a plaintiff's lawyer on the religious accommodation?
Well, I think that certainly the comparison between the religious accommodation versus the accommodation analysis under the ADA, which I think we'll get into in a little bit, is stark. And we certainly on the plaintiff's bar would wish that the analysis under Title VII would be more rigorous on employers. The fact is that, as we've discussed, it's not very hard for an employer to show an undue hardship on their business under the religious standard. So it makes it a lot more difficult for people who have sincere religious beliefs to be able to work with their employer to gain some sort of accommodation. For example, Saturdays off, Sundays off, as you suggested, certain religious apparel that someone wants to wear. And, we have maybe a harder time at this point trying to argue that the employer does not have an undue hardship in accommodating that. In terms of the Supreme Court and its current composition, I'm not seeing that changing anytime soon.
And thanks, Christine. I think that there's the dichotomy in the Supreme Court. On the one hand, they've been very religious or religion friendly. They've also been very employer friendly. So this is where their friendships conflict. So
yeah, I would suggest that at least it's my interpretation / opinion that the religious component would outweigh their preference for employer friendly policies.
So you think that the Supreme Court would be more likely to expand or to reduce, let's get the right word, to take the undue hardship and make it a little more rigorous instead of the de minimis, or you think they would uphold the de minimis standard?
No, I think that they would hold. So I think that there's a preference, at least for some of the Supreme Court, to give more power and more consideration to religious beliefs. So my guess is that instead of, for example, changing the standard from the one that's currently in existence from the TWA case to one that's equivalent to the ADA, that they would potentially leave that alone. So not change anything about the law currently.
Okay, thanks. We got a question, a couple of questions. One is from Jody from Illinois, and she asked if can employers legally require employees to take the vaccine? A lot of people are concerned about the safety since it's emergency use. Doesn't it violate a person's rights to require it? I'm going to jump in quickly and say, I mean, that's kind of, Jody, where we were. And does it violate their rights? I'm not sure, but when it comes to employers, when we think of rights and Constitution, it doesn't apply to private employers, the Constitution. So the question is, does it violate their rights to require it? The rights that we have are in statutes like the Americans with Disabilities Act or Title VII. There's just not a general right to say privacy from your employer. So if you can't find a statute that's going to prohibit an employer from doing this, then the employer is generally within its right to require it. David, I think, is nodding. So he's giving me the thumbs up, and I think Christine too. My next question is from Tora Bradley, and I didn't ask for this question, but I'm thankful because they said, if you are to unionize, do mandatory vaccines become negotiable item under terms of employment? And my next person to ask on their view on this was John Boardman. So John, that's the first question. Is this a mandatory subject of bargaining? And then my second question really is, how do you view the employer's obligations in your role and your employees' roles in this whole issue?
Thanks, David. We view this subject as a mandatory subject of bargaining. It is a health and safety issue, which falls within the purview of what normally is covered in collective bargaining. And this particular issue definitely, in our opinion, falls under that. Our view is that the employer has the obligation, but they also have an obligation for a safe environment. And so that moving forward, they have to strike a balance between a safe environment and those requirements of the law. You cited a case that has the de minimis standard. Can somebody be accommodated that is not going to voluntarily receive the vaccine? The answer is probably we could all find certain circumstances where that's possible. Does the employer have an obligation to bargain over it? Yes. But the employer also, in our opinion, has an obligation to create a safe environment for the people who are going to be populating that workplace. So it is, as usual, a balancing of interests from the individual who is asserting the right to the employer, and therefore the employees also in the workplace to be protected as well.
John, just as follow up when I agree with you that it's a mandatory subject of bargaining. I don't know how you could argue it's not. But it's kind of a funky issue because it's arising in the life of contracts. I mean, some contracts are somewhere being negotiated right now, but it's more where it's in the middle of a contract and it's a new issue. And it is in some ways kind of a 1-0 issue. We're going to require everyone. You come in and say, well, no, we'd like to make it, voluntary, this, that, however you play it. This is a 1-0 issue in a way. There's not a lot of movement at a certain point where the employer says everybody has to do this. They can negotiate to impasse and implement their final offer, and their final offer is everybody has to be vaccinated. How does a union, how do you react to that, and how do you explain that to your members, or do you not see it happen?
No, I think it's entirely possible, David, that what you've just described will in fact occur in certain settings. Let me just very quickly address the issues that you've laid out. One is the fact, in our view, the fact that a contract is in term, you're in the middle of it, does not, in our opinion, negate the fact that the employer has an obligation to bargain over this particular health and safety agreement. Unless there is specific contract language which waives all those rights to bargain over health and safety issues. And I'm not aware of any contract in my 40 plus years of bargaining that has that. So whether the contract is in term or not has no consequence with respect to this issue. With respect to the employer making a mandatory requirement, we would argue that that falls under the category of collective bargaining, and that through that collective bargaining process, each of the parties will make a case about what they want to do with that assertion. I know we're sitting here trying to establish hard and fast rules, and sometimes my experience is that it's not possible to establish hard and fast rules for every single circumstance. If you have a bargaining unit of 500 people and you have one person who is objecting to being vaccinated, that's very different than having a bargaining unit where 75% of the people are refusing to be vaccinated. And so you may, through the bargaining process, reach an accommodation for that one person that protects the interest of the 499 and their health concerns and whatever assertion that one individual is making. So I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule that we can set out here at the beginning without looking at the fact-specific issues of the case.
And Dave, let me just chime in for a second, kind of agreeing with what John said, is one person objecting is easy. If you have 75% objecting and the employer wants to implement their final offer and the people still don't come in, what are you going to do? Fire 75% of your workforce when you need them to work? So there's a lot, I'm sure John would agree, there's a lot of practical considerations that would happen, and you'd like to think that management and union get together and figure this out on a case-by-case basis.
And thanks, John and David. And so, Abigail, you have union employees where you have to negotiate with John, and you have to, and you have a hotel where John is in John's jurisdiction. So that's a thing you'll be doing if you haven't already. But you also have non-union hotels, probably more of those throughout the country. So I assume that your thought process is you've got the union and non-union. The non-union, you're doing what you think is best. The union, you're doing it through negotiations. What's your mindset on what employers can and should be doing, and what you would be advising to be doing given this issue?
Yeah, well, I think David's comment about the practical considerations is a good segue to that as well, because while as an HR professional who has a lot of responsibility in the U.S. with a company that's global, I would say we stepped back and have more of a worldview even. And before we got to the legal considerations, which certainly aware of the need for religious and medical accommodations in the U.S. and the statutes we're talking about, But before we even got to that, there's a culture discussion. And is this really the battle that we want to have on forcing people to have vaccination? So instead, from an alignment with culture and what we think's right for our people, has been much more about education and helping people get the right information so that they can make the right choice, versus as an employer dictating or mandating that this is something that people have to do. And our position has been, except where government mandated, we're going to lead with education and help people make that choice. We certainly encourage vaccination and think that there's a lot of reasons why that's a good way to go, and certainly will help business thrive, as well as protect people and their families, which from the outside of the pandemic, safety has been our first concern. And leaning into that messaging is part of the education side. So it's honestly been some of the things that we're talking about here, well, certainly debated in meeting rooms or I should say Zoom calls these days. That's been more of the academic side of it than the practical.
So I got another question for you is, let's say that it now becomes a marketing thing, and your competitive set is now saying our employees are fully vaccinated. Does that force you to rethink, what you're doing if you're looking and saying we're going to lose market share?
Yeah, we've had some of that conversation, while not necessarily pushed by our competitive set at this point, but we still think that the practical reality of being able to make that a broad factual statement represents, especially globally, so many challenges that we think there's a lot of other ways to lean into the safety. And even once vaccinated, we still think there's an awful lot of protocols around safety, certainly for the short term, masking and social distancing and the other sanitation protocols that are much more of what we see as continuing to double down on than a statement that, again, we think is fraught with peril being able to factually assert.
Thanks, Abigail. David, we're getting questions. There's seems people are law focused, at least at the beginning. Can an employer give a big bonus or an incentive to those vaccinated? Is that fair or legal, or is it discrimination against those who do not get the vaccine? What's your gut reaction?
It is legal. People are giving incentives. I mean, my mantra pretty much has been, what Abigail said. How about education? My mantra to my clients has been, we should, quote, strongly encourage, not just encourage, but strongly encourage. They want to, as you can imagine, I've been doing COVID nonstop since the beginning, and it's gone in stages. First, how do you get people out of the office? How do you do remote? Now we're talking about bringing them back, which is part of the vaccine. And some people want to bring them back and require vaccines. And I'm like, is it different? And we'll get to this question, but I'll just pose it. There's a difference between can I legally, or should I? And we'll talk more about that. Can you? Yeah, pretty much you can, with a couple of caveats. One is ADA, one is religious accommodation. We talked about the religious accommodation, but part of the education and the strongly encouraging is making it easy. I have clients who are having vaccinations on site to make it easy. People come to work, they can get a vaccination right then and there. They don't have to sign up someplace and go through a whole thing to do this. You can, and if you do, you get a bonus. You get something of value. Yes, you can do it, and you can, require it if that's where you choose to go. But you need to be careful whether that makes sense for your individual organization. Just don't say, I'm going to require it. There's going to be pushback and issues to deal with.
Christine, I want to get two things. I want to get your view on that exact same question, but then I have another question that it dovetails into it, if you could answer on both. And that's it. We have a healthcare professional who says, hey, I work in a hospital. We have to get flu shots every year. We all have to get COVID-19 shots. Why isn't it just every service industry has to do the same thing? Basically, why are you wasting my time and talking about this? I take the shot. Why can't all other service people take the shot and call it a day? So, Christine, what do you say?
Yeah, it's interesting that she's specifically pointing to service employees versus not, right? Because I think you need to have a different analysis when someone is customer facing or service facing versus when they are just working on a computer or in an office. But going back to, I think, David's discussion about mandatory vaccines, I agree. I think that it's pretty clear that you can mandate the vaccines, but I do think that opens employers up to a lot of potential issues and a lot of ways in which they can run afoul of the law. And so if an employer is going to mandate vaccines, they have to be very careful. So the first step is, okay, mandating vaccines, you have to then be aware of requests for accommodation, either on the basis of religious or disability grounds. I think it's pretty clear, especially based on prior case law with flu vaccines, that it's not a reasonable accommodation to just exempt someone from a mandatory vaccine and let them continue to work in the environment with everyone else. So instead of, well, can I please just not take it and work anyway and do the status quo? The following analysis is, well, what kind of reasonable accommodations can there be? And that's where, number one, at least under New York City law, you have to engage in an interactive process. And if you don't do that, it's a de facto violation of the law, which is not necessarily true under federal law. But in any event, you're going to want to come into the interactive process. You're going to want to talk about what types of accommodations there are, such as working from home, and then determine whether that's an undue hardship. And then you're having a different analysis from religious accommodations versus medical accommodations. So, I think that employers just need to do it right. And, we're seeing employers not doing it right. Number two, why can't employers just require vaccinations in service industries like they do in hospitals? And I think that that's a little different. So you have people in hospitals that have various issues with their immune systems. They are working with highly sensitive populations. I think that there is more reason to vaccinate potentially. I don't know that those reasons necessarily apply outside of hospital context.
Thanks, Christine. I have another question, and it sort of goes to both Abigail and John. And I'm hosting a webinar, and so the joint employer doctrine has to be involved because it always has to be. And somebody's asking me this by saying, Ryan asked, will the request of employers result in a shift to greater outsourcing to contract labor for services related? And you think about that, you say, to Abigail's point and to David's point and John's too, when they talked about, what if 75% don't want to do the vaccine, and you've got some counters, with you want to advertise that you have everyone's vaccinated, or you health and safety concerns, other employees, you could easily use a contract labor provider and tell that provider, only send me vaccinated people. You don't have to worry about their morale and of those that you didn't hire because you never saw them anyway. So you could do that. So Abigail, do you see, not Four Seasons per se, but do you see that folks in the industry, employers in the industry, looking at contract labor as sort of a safe way to deal with a pushback on on vaccines that you can get these folks from contract labor. And then I'm going to go and ask John both if he sees that and if giving you the preview and what you're going to do about it. So Abigail, what do you think? Do you think that your HR colleagues across the industry have that in their hip pocket?
I guess my off the top response to that is going to be, David, not necessarily on topic of this, but that's probably somewhere people are being forced more just because of the labor shortages before they're being forced that way to be able to make a statement again about vaccination. Just especially what we're seeing in the southern portion of the U.S. and just the talent war out there. I think putting other layers on it at the moment, that's probably not the extra lever most people are headed toward, just given the needs. So
that it's you've got enough problems staffing your hotel. You're going to use contract labor if you need to, or some folks are going to use it if they need to. We did, as an industry, look at how much contract labor was going in the last, during the Obama administration, and said, wow, this is out of control. And I think a lot of operators scaled back. Now with the labor shortage, they might go forward, but not to avoid vaccines, the anti-vax people, but more just to fill their slots.
Yeah, that's my general answer. And again, I think what we saw previously and some of the scale back was just the realization of how expensive contract labor had become for most organizations, and especially as organizations were overly reliant on them. So there's some writing of that, but right now I think it's more out of desperation just to fill roles.
Thanks, Abigail. John, I have some hypotheticals. I've got a question from David Connor, and he's asking if he's saying he's heard that meeting planners, when they're choosing their property for their convention, one of the things they're looking for is everybody vaccinated? And if that becomes and it's sort of like the question I asked before, but if that becomes a mantra of meeting planners and the properties that are getting the groups are those that are fully vaccinated, and the operator says to you, hey, John, if we can do this, we'll get more business and there'll be more banquet work and more work for all your employees. How about it? How do you deal with that when you see the real business aspect of it? And then also, how do you react if they turn around and say, okay, we get it, we're not going to force people, we're going to use contract labor? And that's, not a good thing for the union. So on both ends, how do you play that?
That's a great question, David. And I just want to return for 1 second to something you were covering earlier, which is what can employers do? The fact is that the overwhelming majority of employers that we're dealing with are very proactive on this issue. A number of them are offering incentives to employees. We have employers who have hosted vaccination sites at their facilities for not only their employees, but employees of other employers who work with the union. So I want to commend the employer community for being proactive in that respect. To your next point, I don't think there's any doubt that part of a brand identity is ultimately in the short term going to be tied to what they do with this particular issue. And your questioner is correct. There are many meeting planners out there right now who are saying, we are willing to book, but we have a standard that we want you to be able to check off before we sign on the line. So I think it's not an unreasonable request. The science is certainly there. The question goes back to what I was mentioning before, and that is, what is it that we are actually dealing with? In our environment, we are not finding huge objection to, in a legitimate way, that being religious or medical, large objection to getting vaccinated. So I continue to say, let us focus on what the outliers are, and it appears that there, at least in my environment, are not a whole lot of them. Are there accommodations we can make? Can we recognize the fact that there is a customer base out there that this is critically important to, and that also recognize that that importance is just as important to the employer's employees, our members, and see if we can't reach an accommodation where everyone is happy. But I don't think it's an unreasonable request for the customer to stake out that position, nor do I think it's an unreasonable request for the employer to establish it as a brand identity. The question is, what do we do with those few outliers where we can't match that brand identity with the few outliers request?
Thanks, John. Christine.
Yeah, I just want to point out that we are in the very beginning stages of employers considering these policies. So it's not necessarily that we're seeing all of what Mr. Boardman is saying are outliers. I think as employers make these types of decisions, more and more people will come forward. I think whether it be that they have religious objections, or I think more likely that there is a medical reason for their not being able to get the vaccine. So I at least anticipate more people coming to us on the plaintiff side and saying, I have a medical reason for not getting the vaccine. I want to, for example, continue working from home because that's what I've been doing for the last year and a half. That didn't seem to be too hard for the employer to handle back during the COVID pandemic. I don't know why it's hard now. And, they're threatening to fire me because I won't get vaccinated. And, they're saying that they can't reasonably accommodate me one way or the other. So I'm stuck. What do I do?
So, thanks, Christine. I actually I want to explore that and segue into the disability. But before we do that, got a couple questions that kind of fit. And so I just want you to have those in your heads. I'm going to go to David and then Christine on some legal issues. The first question is somebody asked, can we ask during an interview if you've been vaccinated or not? And can we require it as part of an interview, which I think to Abigail's point, you have less of a morale issue if the person you've never met before, you just say sorry, as opposed to the person that's worked for you for 10 years. So there's a legal question, can you ask? My answer is yes. And if the person says, no, I'm not vaccinated, can I refuse to hire them? My answer is yes. You can do that. We just talked about it from a religious standpoint, but then the segue is into the ADA. Because we know with disability, if the duty to accommodate is de minimis in religion, it's a lot more than de minimis in disability. It's a lot in disability. We don't have a term for it, but it's a lot. And one of the, Christine brought it up, and I think it was Karen asked about, well, what about accommodations, about let me work from home? And there's a great case out of the Seventh Circuit in the 90s, Van Zandt versus State of Wisconsin, which says that is unreasonable to ask to work at home. But that was the 90s. And technology has improved significantly. And then we just worked at home for a year. So that is an interesting thing to think about. But now when we talk about the Disability Act, we say you need to be able to do the essential functions of the job. David, will you make the argument that being vaccinated is the essential function of the job for somebody working at the bell stand or somebody working at the front desk? We're not talking about, you can't work at home at the bell stand. So we know that. So is it an essential function of the job to be vaccinated when you are going to be, and you can't put plexiglass up there either when you're taking the luggage.
Right. Well, your speech just now had a lot of stuff in it. First, with respect to, let me quickly address some things. First, when you're interviewing someone, can you ask yes? Can you not hire them? Well, maybe they need an accommodation for that. So, I don't think you just say no, but I guess I would have a conversation with them about it, kind of like what Christine said. Like, why? Because you could go next door and get vaccinated, like the next room over. We can just eliminate that as an issue. There is a standard for ADA accommodation. It's undue hardship, and that's not de minimis. That's kind of, like you said, a lot, or can be. As far as working from home, sure, the Van Zandt case says, that's not an accommodation, but that was different times, different facts. And like you said, we've just been doing it. But, my take on the work from home as an accommodation is, okay, so when does this end? I don't want, okay, if you want to work from home another month or 2 or 3 or 6, that's one thing, but this is not a permanent work from home job. Even if it's an office job, we want people back in the office, maybe, if that's what you want. Now, as to the bell stand, yeah, it's going to be an essential function of the job. That to a certain extent, if you are that close to customers where there is no plexiglass, like when you check into a hotel now, there's plexiglass, maybe you're not, and I've been in hotels, they're wearing masks, there's plexiglass, they're not, it's a different sort of interaction at the bell stand. Essential function of their job? Sure. I mean, the employer can do that. They should put it in their job description now to prove that. But again, to me, so that's the law. But to me, that's just the beginning of the conversation. As we've heard John, Christine, and Abigail say, I could be the hard ass management lawyer and say, yeah, but when I'm talking to my clients, I'm saying you need to think this through. Everything everyone has said. Is this what you want to do? Is this the employee relations issue do you want to die on that hill? Do you want to make people feel this way now when people are already insecure, as opposed to educating, strongly encouraging? And every time you take a step in a certain direction, you get more people vaccinated and they talk. Well, maybe more people get vaccinated and they talk. And all of a sudden, you have a critical mass of people and you have it done correctly, the right way, without using a sledgehammer and firing people for not doing it, which is not what I'm advocating. I think that you need to do it, a different way. But the law says you can, so it's always there. It's complicated.
Thanks, David. Abigail, you're nodding to a lot of David's comments, but I'd like you to get your take on, again, whether or not you'll ask people during the interview, and then how you'll accommodate, and again, whether you'll take the position that certain jobs, this is essential function. I'm not going to have non-vaccinated people in this, in this one task. My night cleaner who never sees somebody, or my landscaper who I'm not outsourcing, I'm doing. That's one thing. They're cutting the grass outside. Fine. But my bell stand, yes. So are you in that mode? Is that how you're seeing it? Is that how the HR folks are doing when you're talking to them?
Yeah, I was nodding when David was talking, because my first reaction when you posed the question of, is it a legal question to ask? My first question is, why would I want to ask that? Because what am I going to do with that information? And what decision am I going to make with that information? And again, from the standpoint of putting so much equity and investment into the type of employer that we want to be, I think a lot of what David was talking about is how we work together with people and bring them along, which again goes back to the strongly encouraging and the education. I would want to use up all of the tools in that arsenal before we take those additional steps. And to Christine's point, especially at this stage, depending on how this all evolves and where it goes, maybe there'll be a different perspective later on. I think what you were talking about with a meeting planner making those requests of only vaccinated associates serving them, is certainly something that we've bounced around and had conversations around. We saw that quite a bit with the testing side, and we want only people who have tested negative to be able to serve. So I could see where it gets to that next evolution, but we still think, given what some people's concerns about the vaccine could be, is that's still a bridge too far at this point. I'd rather work with people collaboratively, because I think that's going to be more in line with what we're trying to accomplish as an organization.
I want to go to Christine next, but I want to follow up with you, Abigail. One question, and it's from Olivia from the audience, and she wants to know what happens. What do you do with one of your employees who says, employee over there is not vaccinated. I do not want to work with that individual. I don't want to be in a room with that person. I live with my 90-year-old mother, and I'm not going to be carrying this. So tell that person, get out.
Yeah. I think our conversations, again, have been back to the education, what we know about how the virus transmits, and all of the other things before vaccines were even available that we've introduced in order to keep people safe, and that we were working and safe prior to vaccines. And that's why those measures are still in place, and we're continuing to use those. And we would double down on the education on that end in a scenario such as what Olivia is bringing up. And those are the conversations we're having, and that's why we're insisting those protocols stay in place.
Thanks, Abigail. Christine.
Yeah, I just want to be careful with absolutes here. Right now, the science is backing the fact that the vaccination, helps prevent spread of COVID and then protects the person with variants that come up with increased research. I want to be careful about saying that absolutely someone that is public facing has to be vaccinated, and that's just an essential function, and period, end of story, no more analysis. So that's one thing I wanted to point out, that we just need to consider individualized analyses at all times. The second point is that we also need to protect the safety of the rest of the employees, right, in your workplace. And that's not just a moral requirement, but that's certainly a legal requirement. So we have, OSHA's stance on vaccinations. They encourage it. We have, a New York law that was just recently passed by the legislature and waiting for Cuomo to sign, called the HEROES Act, which requires certain safety procedures in workplaces in light of COVID-19. And, there is certainly a chance that an employer could be sued for failing to create an unsafe environment. So that's kind of the opposite end of the coin here.
Thanks, Christine. John, I'm guessing that it would make your life really easy if all the new employees were vaccinated. And then you wouldn't have to worry about negotiating for those that didn't want to be vaccinated. That'd be a good day, right?
David, I long for the day when we have new employees being hired. Right now, I wish I could tell you that that's the case, but it's not. And the answer is yes. And to Abigail's point, so much, I think, of what is going to play out in terms of the interpersonal relationship between employees around this issue is going to be based on momentum that is created as more and more people get vaccinated. The fact is that the overwhelming majority of the workforce, at least in the hotels we represent and in my market, are not currently back to work. And as more and more people get vaccinated and it becomes more and more the common thing, I think there will be the type of group pressure on individuals who come back into the workplace, with or without an employer mandate, to make sure that they're vaccinated. This is a conversation that's already taking place in the workplaces where people are back to work. So I'm encouraged with what I am seeing now in terms of people getting vaccinated, and the resistance, at least as far as we're seeing, is relatively low and much better than what we expected.
Much better, meaning not as adamant against it.
Yes, that's correct.
Much less.
David, can I ask John a question?
Please do.
Hey, John, I don't know your agreement, but on recall rights, is there any way to recall people who have been vaccinated over than people who are not vaccinated? Obviously, the seniority trumps most everything, I'm assuming, but as a secondary factor, sometimes skill and ability is in there. I mean, argue that vaccination is part of that process to get recalled. You're vaccinated, you come back sooner? I'm just curious.
That's a great question.
Great question, David.
Well, that's why you have me here.
As you know, we worship at the altar of seniority. So
right.
You are correct in your assumption that, at least in my setting and the ones I'm aware of, seniority does prevail for purposes of recall. We have provisions in our agreements that allow cascading rights. So if I don't want to come back in now, I can pass my right to return at this point in time to somebody in the same classification lower on in the seniority list. There comes a point at which the employer needs everybody back, and therefore everyone's going to be confronted with this vaccinated versus not vaccinated. But there are ways, at least in my setting, to defer that by simply allowing somebody junior to come in before I come back.
I have another question, and I'm going to go to Abigail on this, and then get John's opinion. This is somebody who's a meeting planner and saying, I'm coming with a different perspective. Can I require all my attendees to be vaccinated? And, legally, I'm kind of thinking public accommodations, but I don't really think there's much law that protects people to be able to go to a conference at that level. So I don't think there's much. And I'm looking at Christine thinking it's not a great lawsuit, like I didn't get to go to the conference. But Abigail, from a operation standpoint, you wouldn't deal with it, but I guess the meeting planner would. And if what would you say if they asked that?
I think from the operations perspective, we would say that's between you and your participants. And I wouldn't think we would take a role in helping to enforce it. And have you spoken to your attorney would be my...
Hey, Dave, let me make a comment, because we represent tons of not-for-profits and associations, hundreds. And we've actually written on this, and yeah, you can. And I could send you an alert your way that you can post if anyone's interested in this. But yeah, they can.
So you can say that for your attendees, mm-hmm. And if they don't want to do that, then my grandfather used to say, then they won't. If they don't want to come, they don't have to go home. So that was his big line. So I guess we can make that argument.
The universities that are requiring students.
Right, absolutely. Cornell is one of them. I read recently that more than 100 have come out in the last several weeks saying this is it. Faculty, staff, students. But at least the universities that I've read are saying they are going to accommodate religion. They're going to accommodate disability. And when they said they were accommodating religion, they didn't have a parenthetical that said as long as it doesn't have more than a de minimis effect. So I think that they're going to be more accommodating on that one. Christine.
I just want to also point out that although the focus is on the federal law, there are oftentimes state and city laws that have different standards that would apply. So, for example, in New York, the undue hardship standard, the undue burden standard is different and harder to meet than under, say, the de minimis standard for religious accommodation. So just another thing to consider.
I think it's a great point. I think that we sometimes get a little lazy when we talk federal law and we forget about, those things called states, counties, cities, all of whom can have their own. And if you're a multi-city, county, state employer, it can be a nightmare of life trying to comply with everything. But that's a great point. We're pushing up on our last couple of minutes here. So I think in perspective, we know that the federal obligation to accommodate religion is pretty light. The federal obligation to accommodate disability is pretty heavy. And then there are morale issues and so on. And we've kind of gone through this throughout the time about what you would do, but just for each of you, last word as to what your take on it is. We know what we can do. What should we do? John, as you're talking to, you made the comment of 30, 40 years of doing this, 40 years of doing this gig. So there's people who, union presidents who've been doing it for 10. So what's your advice for union members, unionized employers, and union leaders on how to handle this? Because it's in your sweet spot now.
I would say the primary consideration is creating a safe workplace and recognizing that when the workplace is safe for the people that populate it, it's safe for the guests that walk in the front door and use it. The second thing I would say is I don't think at this point it makes sense to jump to the conclusion that we have to have etched in stone rules as to how to make the workplace safe. We don't yet know what we are looking at in terms of participation in vaccination, and we don't yet know what individuals and what their amount will be in terms of trying to avoid vaccination and return to work. My urging continues to be rational, establish good rules for a safe workplace, and then work to try to reach reasonable accommodations for those people who have legitimate claims to them.
Thanks, John. Abigail, same question, and then Stephanie threw in something that sort of fits into your sweet spot. So she wants to know, what are you going to say about, she's asking about concerns about requiring masks and social distancing from when people don't want to do vaccines. And I'm also thinking, what are you going to do when somebody says, hey, I don't want to wear a mask and you're forcing me to wear a mask because this person doesn't want to get vaccinated? So last word with those in your mind.
Yeah. Well, certainly we were hearing in the news cycle some of the challenges the airlines are having with customers and mask wearing, and how it's been certainly a heated topic. I think our perspective on that is the mask is just like any other part of our PPE or our uniform. And we really feel that the science is behind that, and that's part of the condition of working. Beyond that, I think John framed things up nicely. That first and foremost, it's safety of the environment for our team members and for our guests. And there's a number of different methods that we have to come at that, from the masking, from the social distancing, and then continuing to encourage and educate around the vaccine that we think is part of the path out of this.
Thanks, Abigail. Christine.
Yeah, I want to encourage employers not to forget about their minority employees, disabled or people with different religious views. Diversity is incredibly important, and these people add to the environments that they work in. So, let's do the individualized inquiries. Let's make sure we get it right. And if you don't, WIGDOR is here to help remind you. So,
thanks, Christine. And if WIGDOR comes calling, you can call David.
And all I'll add is I agree with Abigail. Be encouraging. Educate. I'll add 2 other words to it. Be creative, be flexible. And I think if we do all of those things, we will take care of Christine's hopes and desires, and hopefully all of John's employees will get back to work sooner.
Well said.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, John. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We hope this was helpful, and we hope we'll see you again soon.